All right, thanks, Morgan. Let's talk about orchards. And, you know, a lot of this is functioning on the same principles that Mike talked about with the impact to oak trees. But when we're thinking about the impact to orchards, and, you know, this is if you have a production orchard, but this is also relevant for some of you guys who might have just some trees around your property for your own consumption. It matters to think about whether you're looking at damage of burn or heat damage. It matters to be looking at the damage in the canopy versus the trunk. So we'll talk a little about that. And then talk through what to expect in terms of the signs of damage, the timing of that damage, and the potential for recovery. And then what to do about it, which I think I would echo what lots of folks have already said is be patient. There's a lot of recovery that you might not expect that will manifest. I would say a little differently from the natural systems, getting some water on your trees now to be sure those roots aren't drying out, not too much, but just a little bit. And then if you are in a situation where you want to be replanting the whole orchard, we'll talk about some considerations for that. Okay, so thinking about the impact of fire to trees, heat versus burn, what you see on the left is heat damage of just the heat of that fire actually expands the water, boils the water such that it bursts the cells that that water is in. And then so those cells sort of fall apart and can never recover. So that tissue that got heated up cannot recover. Whereas you see on the left, that tree, actually the carbon in that tree combusted and burned. So these are sort of the two extremes of the manifestation of fire to wood or to the trees. And it matters as well where the fire has had the impact. If you're looking at up in the canopy versus down in the trunk, as you see here, you know, we need to remember that the trunk is really the conduit of all the water and nutrients to get up into that canopy. So if the trunk is quite damaged, no amount of, you know, that canopy is not going to recover. Whereas if you just have damage up in the canopy, you can cut that back for sanitation reasons so it doesn't get more diseases spreading around there. And then we can move nutrients, the tree can move nutrients and water up to support future growth. So in terms of what to expect, you know, it's a really broad spectrum, as I said, whether you're on the far left here of those leaves being scorched, but the wood still being viable, or the far right here of the whole tree having burned to the ground. And there's a lot of things that we can see in between. So if heat was sort of approaching the structure of the tree, the trunk, the canopy, we can have boiled sap, which will manifest as this bleeding, which you see here, if you can see my cursor. And that's really the sap is boiled and it's burst out of the sugar pipes, the phloem. Or as we sort of move up the spectrum of damage, we can get that deep heat damage that Mike was talking about with oaks. So we have a couple of layers of cells here that matter to us. We have on the outside our sugar pipes, which circulate energy around the tree. And then we have the cambium layer, which Mike was talking about. And that is what makes cells for future years. So when that's damaged, that means the tree can't make cells in the future, can't make sugar and water pipes in the future. And then on the inside of that, of those sort of stem cells, that cambium, we have the water pipes, which conduct water all around. So we can see that damage might be go all the way in to damage the cambium, but only on part of the tree. You might see that damage, that heat damage, get all the way around to really girdle the tree in essence. And obviously you can't go through each tree and cut it off of the trunk to see how damaged it is, because then what if it looks like this on the left? Well, you already cut the tree down, so it's not going to recover. So, so you'll want to be cutting into the bark to try to assess this. And what you see sort of down here on more close to the bottom On younger trees or thinner barked trees, just taking a knife and cutting away, you'll be able to differentiate. This is irrecuperable tissue on the right, this brown here, and healthy green tissue on the left. As Mike said, you know, with walnuts, which a lot are a lot of the damaged trees that I saw in Pleasants Valley, at least. It can be tough to know what's old dead bark and what is dead future tissue. So I'd recommend finding like a really intensely damaged tree and look for that difference here. You'll find a healthy zone and an unhealthy zone. And so that's the sort of damage you'll see. But I want to emphasize that the timing of this damage, it can take many months to really fully see the damage, for the damage itself to fully manifest. So in terms of any action that you would take, really the best way to do this is wait until spring to see what grows and see what doesn't. Think about this if you've dealt with freeze damage in the past. It's a really similar approach, and it's actually within the tree. It's a very similar problem. The freezing expands the water to burst that cell, destroying the cell, and the boiling of the water also bursts the cell to destroy that cell. So the tree is actually dealing with this damage in a very similar way to freeze damage, and we should as well. You know, so waiting until spring, because the tree can surprise you both ways. Sometimes that xylem, which is, you know, a couple layers in, can keep conducting water up to keep leaves alive. And so it might look like the tree is going to make it, but without that cambium to make water pipes for the following year, it's not going to make it next year. On the other hand, the tree might surprise you in a good way with these adventitious buds, or what Mike referred to as epicormic shoots. So these are buds that are sort of buried in the wood and can really sprout back in an aggressive way. So I would say wait at least a month until normal leaf out timing. What you see here on the right is these two pictures. This is after freeze damage in the spring of 2019. So the freeze itself was November of 2018. This is in Chandler, which usually leaves out in mid-April. And you see here in the foreground a couple of trees that look really rough. And when other trees are already leafing out, it'd be easy to give up hope on these trees, but you wait another month and you see a lot of adventitious growth that's taken off. And so, you know, you would end up pruning a lot less of this tree, having waited to see what can really work out. So in terms of assessing the damage, I would say first and foremost, take lots of pictures because things will change dynamically. You can get, if you have a smartphone, you can get a timestamp app. So that'll put just the date on top of any picture that you take, the way that it used to work with normal film cameras. Start a file with your FSA tree assistance program. I know they're going to talk about, FSA is going to talk later in the program, but in the first 90 days, you need to at least start a file, even if you don't put in a full report about damage until the following spring. And if you do have a crop out there, so like walnut and olive folks, some of you still have some crop that you might want to harvest. So just make sure that you're sorting that out. You're flagging those trees that were damaged versus what aren't, especially if you have a custom guy who's going to come in and be doing that for you. If you feel like there's enough orchard to save, getting a little bit of irrigation out there in these sort of short, frequent sets, making sure you're adjusting for there's not nearly as much transpiring of leaves. So they don't need nearly as much water as they used to get, but they do need a little water to keep that root zone moist so those roots don't dry out, so they're not even more stressed than they already are. You've also likely lost a lot of the canopy cover in terms of the leaves. So especially on young trees, I'd say up to third, fourth, or even fifth leaf, going in with some whitewash to prevent sunburn. So we're only in early September now. We still have at least a month of potentially hot conditions if the skies ever clear out of smoke. So that can prevent future damage. And again, think about this like freeze damage. Wait at least a month until after a leaf out to really do your full assessment of the damage and to go in with any serious pruning. This is just a sort of different way to look at this process if you're more of a flowchart person, not a picture-driven person. So thinking first about the trunk damage, because that's really, if you can't get water up through the trunk and nutrients up through the trunk, it doesn't matter what the canopy looks like. So if that trunk is severely burned or heat damaged, seeing bleeding, boils, dead layers under the bark, or suckering, actually, as Mike was also saying, that's kind of an indication if you get growth near the base of the trunk, that the trunk itself is so damaged that the tree can't get nutrients up and it's sort of diverting those nutrients into new growth at the bottom. If more than 50% of that trunk shows dead tissue below the bark, that tree is probably not going to fully recover. And recovery will be uneven and slow and never quite as productive as in the past. So keep that in mind as you're thinking through this damage assessment. If your trunk is in good shape, then we can start thinking about the canopy condition, whether we have burn or heat damage up in the canopy. If so, we're changing our irrigation up. We're treating this like freeze damage, not pruning until about a month after a leaf out, and thinking about whitewashing the trunk, the primary scaffolds, and the secondary scaffolds. And that whitewashing is just a mix of 50% white house paint and water, 50% water like you would have done at planting. And even if things look okay, keep monitoring. It can take some time for this damage to manifest. Okay, and then what to do when you've kind of done your assessment. You're going to get to the point where you're thinking, do I remove this whole orchard? Do I replant some trees? Or do I try to rehabilitate some trees? And especially if you're in the replant, there will probably be a mix of replant and rehab. So thinking through how much of the orchard is damaged, if that damage is mixed or in zones, how much replumbing is necessary if there's been a lot of damage to your irrigation system, the productivity of that orchard prior to the fire. So, was that orchard sort of on its last leg? Did it have a lot of, say, crown gall or nematode damage, deep bark canker, things that are already going to be stressing those trees out that will make it hard for them to recover if you were to do a heavy prune on them. But especially I would say in middle-aged trees, if they were healthy going into the fire, dehorning them, so severe pruning them back to the secondary scaffolds to cut out damaged tissue is probably going to refill that space faster than a replanted tree. So keep that in mind. You sort of have to balance, was the tree healthy enough beforehand to recuperate from this stress, or was it sort of on its last leg already? If you're seeing mixed damage or and you want to replant some of those trees, I will say that those replants will have a real struggle if they're surrounded by more vigorous, large, healthy trees that will shade them out. You'll also really be combating, do I water just enough for this little tree so I don't drown it? Do I water enough for this large tree so it meets its needs? And you're never really gonna be treating either of them the way that's best for them. So that mixed damage, I think, is more in the column of removing the orchard and restarting. But much more what I've seen is this sort of damage on the roadside, damage on the margins, like in the bottom photo you see here. And that's if those trees need to be pulled out, it's much easier to get new trees growing in that zone because watering them is easier, they'll get more sunlight, etc. If you do decide to pull out your whole orchard, it's important to know that, as we've said about the seed bed, also this fire was hot enough to kill the tree, but might not have been hot enough to kill the pests and diseases in the root zone. So think about this like you'd be ripping out an old orchard. There might still be roots that are viable, that are harboring soil pests or diseases. So if you can, go after all those roots when you're pulling them out. Think about fumigating perhaps, at least testing for nematodes if you're down near the creek zone in the flat of any valley. Think about trying to put in a new crop, or at least changing your root stock to change the genetics up a little bit and give those trees a fighting chance. And that's it. This is my email address. If you have any follow-up questions, I think we might have a little time for questions now.
I'm going to throw one out there for you, Catherine. So you had mentioned irrigation as an important step to try to keep roots alive, but a lot of folks had their irrigation systems and their wells burn. Do you have any suggestions for ways to get water on those trees when the systems are down?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I would say, these trees aren't transpiring a lot, so it doesn't need to be a lot of water. If you can get a water truck out there, really even just one dose between now and when we get rainfall will be a lot more helpful than leaving them high and dry. You can put some sort of dig out a moat around and fill it up to make sure you can get a fair amount of water in one pass if you have a truck come out with water. Pole hoses, yeah, you kind of have to get creative.
All right, thanks. Yeah, we're struggling with a lot of issues here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine.